postmodern theorist Frederick Jameson once said, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." That was certainly true of science fiction in the late 20th century, but it seems now in the 21st we aren't even able to imagine the end of the world. We can only retrogress to a time when any sort of change in reality seemed at all possible. We're nostalgic for the future of the past. For the last nearly 2 decades, film, particularly science fiction, has been encased in amber, unable to move. What we get today is a retread of the visionary films of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The cineplex is stocked with reimaginations of classics like Star Wars, Blade Runner, Star Trek, and Alien. When we do get something new, however, it's more and more likely to be set in the past than in the future. Stranger Things, arguably the most popular sci-fi franchise of the past 2 years, is set in the 1980s. Guillermo del Toro's newest sci-fi flick, The Shape of Water, is set in the early 1960s, and 2017's monster movie epic Kong Skull Island is set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. The period piece, or historical picture, certainly has its place in cinema, but the problem with the recent slate of sci-fi period movies is that their settings seem to be arbitrary and unmotivated, or if motivated, only through the filmmaker's own nostalgia. Even when new sci-fi films are set in the future, they're often set in the past of an already established universe. The newest installment of the Star Trek franchise, Discovery, is set 10 years before the events of Star Trek: The Original Series, which was first broadcast in 1966. Star Trek: The Next Generation, on the other hand, which first aired in 1987, is set 100 years after the events of its predecessor. Today, there is an utter lack of willingness to imagine new futures. We've lost what made science fiction interesting in the first place. Sci-fi, fantasy, and speculative fiction in general serve as avenues for humans to creatively explore our potential and to imagine new forms of science and technology. It's alive! And to concoct new ways of organizing society. It has allowed us to look at the ways in which the world could be otherwise. From its very beginnings as a medium, film explored the potential of human capabilities. Georges Méliès' 1902 silent film A Trip to the Moon brought images of space exploration to international audiences before the Wright brothers had even made their first successful flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Rarely do we see such visionary filmic images today. Stranger Things, for example, is not interested in new ideas at all. Even at its most superficial level, Stranger Things gives us images that are nearly identical to ones we've seen decades ago. The first season of the series is especially egregious in its aping of Steven Spielberg, as many excellent video essays have already pointed out. But the show also doesn't offer an advance over the 1980s on a broader thematic level. What made the suburban sci-fi and horror films of the 1980s like E.T. and Poltergeist so compelling in the first place is that they expressed a fundamental discontent with the American dream supposedly embodied by the suburbs.
But just as we're losing our confidence in the future, we're also beginning to close the door on our past.
By the late 1970s, the cracks in the post-war Keynesian consensus were beginning to show, and the suburban utopia promised in the early post-World War II period had proven to be an alienating place with new fears and anxieties that were just as real as the urban ones that many families had fled. The genre films of the 80s gave voice to those fears and were subversive in their critique of the failed project of suburbanization and of the status quo more generally. Stranger Things is the opposite of subversive. It unwittingly affirms the past by reveling in its ephemera. Constant references to 1980s pop culture and the glossy packaging of processed foods are supposed to give us a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Is your finger looking good?
And they do. And that's the problem. The 1980s setting is there to do nothing else but give us that fuzzy feeling. It's not there to make a particular statement about the 1980s or even to use the 1980s as an allegory for our present moment. The historical setting simply is not important to the plot of the series at all. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water suffers from a similar affliction. Del Toro's fetish for the 1960s is apparent from the start. As the film opens, we see Eliza Esposito, Sally Hawkins, as she executes her morning routine in preparation for her shift at a government facility. During the scene, the camera pays special attention to the objects: her egg timer, her calendar, her shoe brush, all of which are unmistakably of a period that is not our own. Unlike Stranger Things, the 1960s setting does have some passing relevance to the film's plot here.
Well, I chose 1962 because it's a very important period in which America in many ways starts defining its myth. You know, you're coming out of World War II, there's a huge abundance, there's the wealth and suburban wealth. You know, you have a car in every garage, TV, self-cleaning ovens, petticoats and hairspray, the space race, Kennedy's in the White House, and there is this myth of greatness that partially is created by Madison Avenue. It's very important because that's the last year of this idealistic fairy tale time in concept, because shortly thereafter Kennedy is shot and Vietnam escalates and everything starts to disintegrate.
This sentiment comes through most clearly in a scene where Michael Shannon, as Richard Strickland, is eating breakfast with his family. Strickland's son asks him if he thinks we will have jetpacks in the future. Strickland responds by saying, "Of course, this is America." Well, the future is now, so where are the jetpacks? It's telling that Del Toro had to take us to the past in order to give us a vision of the future. What he gives us is not a future of the present, but a future of the past. So what is it then? Why in 2017 are we unable to imagine our own new futures? Perhaps it is because we are still living in the period of the end of history that Francis Fukuyama famously described in his 1992 book.
You know, it used to be that there were many alternative forms of government, monarchies and fascist dictatorships, and for many years we thought communism was our major rival, an alternative type of civilization. And one by one in this century, every one of those has collapsed. And not every country is a liberal democracy. There are many dictatorships of the right and the left remaining. But as a systematic idea that has some dynamism and some real vitality, liberal democracy is really all there is now.
The Soviet Union, as a subject of international and geopolitical reality, no longer exists.
Without the specter of communism, Stalinized and vulgar though it may have become, other possible futures and new forms of society are literally unimaginable. Capitalism already prescribes the horizon of possibilities within its own logic. The 1960s generation, through the political activities of the New Left, actually did struggle with the possibilities for transforming reality. The attempt to reckon with reality was reflected in that generation's vision of the future told through science fiction, and it gave us some of the greatest sci-fi masterpieces ever to grace the screen. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Star Wars, and Alien, to name a few. The recent slate of remakes buries everything that was interesting about that historical moment of the 60s and 70s. The current generation avoids struggle entirely by resolving it preemptively. Films like 2016's Rogue One and 2017's Alien Covenant are both prequels to their 1970s predecessors. Thus, the films aren't dealing with new problems, they aren't advancing the story, they're merely providing a justification for problems that have already been resolved. While the films of the late 20th century may still appear fresh in comparison to the tired retreads we get today, the films of the 70s likewise pale in comparison to the earliest experiments in science fiction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, first published in 1895, imagines an apparently utopian society of AD 802,701, where, quote, "The air was free from gnats, the earth from weeds or fungi, everywhere were fruits and sweet and delightful flowers. Brilliant butterflies flew hither and thither. Diseases had been stamped out." Olav Stapleton's Last and First Men, published in 1930, similarly tells a future history of mankind, millions of years into the future, where man has evolved into a race of philosophers and artists with very liberal sexual morality. The sheer time gap from the present imagined in these stories alone amounts to an optimism about the potential of our species for survival and perfectibility. Many of the late 20th century estimations of the future are incredibly conservative by that measure. 2001: A Space Odyssey is, of course, set in the now past. So where does the optimism of Wells and Stapleton come from? During the periods in which these two men were writing, society was struggling with its own self-transformation in a very concrete way. The emergence of socialist ideologies in the 18th century and the organized attempts in the early 20th to enact a world socialist revolution created in the public imagination a sense that anything was possible. For the men and women of that era, the future was rife with potential. Charles Fourier, an early utopian socialist, prophesied that man would turn the seas into lemonade and that night would be lit by 2 moons. Such speculation seems laughable today, but Fourier's sentiment is a worthwhile one.
He designed a utopia that was the most completely detailed, probably, of any literary utopia you can imagine, and one of the wildest in all sorts of ways.
His utopia, of course, was not derived from an imminent historical critique of society the way that later socialists like Lenin would formulate their critiques. But even Fourier's stance appears refreshing in our contemporary moment, where the only utopian visions come from the most reactionary elements of society, namely jihadism and radical Islam. Since the failure of the International Socialist Revolution in the 1920s and the regression of the collective political imagination, our fictional depictions of the future have also regressed. The 1960s New Left temporarily breathed life into the utopian project but ultimately failed. And by the 1990s, the Soviet Union had fallen, and so-called actually existing socialism was dead. Until society once again takes up the struggle for its own transformation, the political possibilities of the present will constrain our ability to imagine new realities. In the meantime, grab a bucket of popcorn and get ready for the next remake.
That anything was there. Come on, dear young revolutionary capitalists. The grooms in the gutters. The bride just pissed herself. I've been working on the new Oliver Twist. 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 I've been working on the new Oliver Twist.